Ever since the election happened, the media has been inundating you with the alleged reasons that it went down the way it did. A lot of these arguments conflict directly with each other. Like some people say Biden should never have dropped out, and others say the opposite. He should have dropped out a long time ago, so there would be this open competition for the next Democratic candidate through the primaries. Some people say sexism and racism obviously played a pivotal role. Others say it obviously didn't. Some say Kamala didn't do enough to win over people who have been turning more conservative. Others insist she leaned way too hard in that direction and lost liberals. The media is tossing so much at you that it's virtually impossible to know which of these claims has any validity. So today, I am going to do that for you. Last week, I looked at demographics, all these conflicting claims about how people in various racial or ethnic or religious groups voted. Today, the why of the election, the reasons for this result, what we really know at this point. That includes a question that some of you have been raising, how the media itself affected this election. There is some interesting data around that, and how a deep bias at the New York Times reared its ugly head yet again with a piece that makes no sense about why the election went the way it did. I'm going to give you a little window into the process of op-eds and trying to get them published at the New York Times. All that coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. It is so good to have you here. We got a lot to get into today. I'll just tell you real quickly, if you're new, thanks for joining us. My background is 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, and then 10 on CNN, where I became lead on-air fact-checker. I have always seen these major problems in the mainstream media. And through this podcast, I'm talking to you about what these systemic problems are and how we can fix them together. With each episode, I put out a newsletter filled with links and facts. I'd love for you to check it out. I don't expect anyone to take my word for anything. And you can tell me if I get things wrong. Later on in the episode, I will explain to you how to reach me. Anyway, you can get my newsletter. You can find it all at my website, joshlebs.com. It's free, but if you choose to become a paid subscriber, you get exclusive content, which will actually help you in a pragmatic way because you can cancel subscriptions to a bunch of places you might currently be paying and still get their stuff for free in a legit legal way that I explain to my paid subscribers. Anyway, you can find the link in the show notes or at my website. All right, let's dig in. I might date myself by saying this, but do you remember Choose Your Own Adventure books? Maybe they still exist. I don't know. But when I was little, we had these. So like you would get to the end of a chapter, and if you want one thing to happen next, you turn to this page. If you want a different thing, you turn to that page. Yes, I know that effectively that's what video games are these days, even though I know nothing about video games, as my kids will happily tell you. Anyway, I've been thinking about that in recent days because the media tossing all of these arguments at you, all of these claims about what happened and what could have happened and why the election went down the way it did. It's like you get to choose your own reason. You can even think of something in your mind and be like, I bet it was because of that. And then go Googling and you will probably find someone saying it. I've heard from some people saying she should have chosen Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as her vice president. And I've found columns saying that. Others say, no, that would have been even worse. And I found columns saying that. There is a global backlash against incumbents in general. That is true. Incumbent parties and candidates are getting tossed out all over the world. A listener sent me some pieces from The Economist. One referred to this saying, we are living in an era of grouchiness. It said people are grouchy against current government. But then there are pundits saying, yeah, that's happening, but Kamala could have avoided that. I opened up a newsletter from The Atlantic, and that one was filled with a bunch of different pieces offering different takes. One of them said that she originally was going after big businesses, but then stopped going after big businesses and should have taken them on, and that would have helped her. Well, would it? I mean, Trump has the public backing of the world's richest business leader, and that doesn't seem to have hurt him. At this point, the vast majority of this woulda, shoulda, coulda stuff is based on feelings, not facts. What I want to do for you here is tell you what we know. So let's start with this. This is a clip of Doug Collins, former representative from Georgia, the state where I live. He was interviewed on Fox.
I think the real interesting part for me is watching this, as I've watched, both our Republicans and Democrats go at this for a long time, is that the polling was consistent about what mattered to Americans. And it was the economy, inflation, border, and then you had the other things. And it was never failing in this race.
Let's start with what we know about the economy. I explained last week that when it comes to exit polls, there's so many problems with them. And when it comes to small differences or small changes, we really can't read into them. But when a number is really big, then it's clear. There are these two exit polls that most media are using. In both exit polls, about 2/3 of Americans had a negative view on the economy. That does not mean that 2/3 of them went to Trump. When asked which candidate they trust more with economics, the results were not as far off as you might think. In one of these polls, just barely over half, 52% said Trump, while just under half, 46% said Kamala. Those figures are close, and these are those problematic exit polls. So it does not seem to be some big blowout by Trump. For a lot of voters, that was the biggest issue. Maybe around a third of voters said that was their top issue. And among them, more went for Trump than went for Kamala. So that worked in his favor, but not in some massive, overwhelming way. Another big issue that you just heard Doug Collins refer to is immigration. Here is something that Fareed Zakaria said on CNN. He said the Democrats made 3 big mistakes.
The first big error was the Biden administration's blindness to the collapse of the immigration system and the chaos at the border. An asylum system that was meant for a small number of persecuted individuals was being used by millions to gain legal entry.
What do we know about how immigration played out in this election? There is evidence that it worked in Trump's favor, but this also was not a blowout for him. How do we know that? Again, from these exit polls. We don't need very specific numbers in order to have a general sense of what they found. What one of these polls found is similar to the economy. It says just barely over half of people trust Trump more in immigration, 53%, a little under half said Kamala, 44%. In the same poll, a majority of voters said they want undocumented immigrants to have a path to citizenship, not be deported, which would put them more in the camp with Kamala Harris than with Donald Trump. Meanwhile, if you look at what the media are saying, you can find arguments in both directions. There's this one piece in The Atlantic arguing that Kamala made a mistake by moving right on the border, that she should have moved farther left on the border. There's no clear data to back that up either. So on these two things, the economy and immigration, all we know at this point is that Trump seems to have edged out Kamala on those two fronts. Here's Fareed again.
The second error was an overzealous misuse of law to punish Trump. The most egregious of the cases pursued was Alvin Bragg's one in New York, one that even he was once skeptical of, but was reportedly pressured by some on the left into pursuing.
I did an episode about Alvin Bragg specifically and the mythology around that. There's no sign that he went from skeptic to political persecution. He said he would look into the facts and decide, and that Trump didn't scare him. And then that is what he did. Also, other people get charged with the same kind of thing that Trump was charged with. So the idea that it was a political witch hunt is not fact. It's an opinion. And that argument could not be any more hypocritical coming from the Trump campaign, which is always talking about blocking up Democrats and locking up political enemies and holding them accountable as alleged traitors. The penalty for treason is death. Trump openly politicized the Justice Department when he was president. Here's how this seems to be shaping up. In the polls, we are seeing that people were concerned about democracy. That actually was a big issue. But on that front, there was no big blowout for Kamala Harris. People who say they care about democracy were split between these two candidates, even though Trump inspired a violent insurrection against the Capitol, even though his own former top officials talk about his authoritarian tendencies and how he disrespects democracy. Even still, people who said that democracy was a major issue to them were split between these two. That suggests that the characterization that people are hearing about what's been happening to Trump has caught on, that there are people who see him as a victim of a political persecution because they say they want democracy and they're supporting him. But again, you can find people on both sides. There are people saying the Justice Department under Biden was way too slow, way too weak against Trump, should have advanced the federal charges much sooner, should have pushed these cases through, should have made it so that he could never run again. There's no proof of what would have happened if the Justice Department had gone further or if it had held back against Trump. So this thing Fareed Zakaria is saying is how he feels, but not backed up by any concrete facts. And here is the third argument from Fareed.
The final error is a more diffuse one, the dominance of identity politics on the left, which made it push for all kinds of DEI policies that largely came out of the urban academic bubble, but alienated many mainstream voters. There's an irony in claiming to be pro-Latino by insisting that people use the term Latinx, only to discover that Latinos themselves think the word is weird. This kind of obsession made Democrats view people too much through their ethnic or racial or gender identity.
That's an example of something that probably makes sense to a lot of people, but there's no data as of now in this election to back it up. So maybe it did play out, but we can't know. Kamala generally did sidestep a lot of that. She avoided talking about running as a woman, about how she would make history, about how she would be the first South Asian president. She clearly did try to appeal to everyone. And again, you can find critics on both sides. There are people who say she should have leaned further to try to appeal to people in certain racial groups. A piece in The Atlantic says in her quest to win conservative voters, she, quote, neglected many of the voters that her party has long relied on. She took far too long to reach out to Black men. As I discussed last week, there's no concrete sign that Black men left the Democratic Party in droves. So people have strong feelings about how identity politics could have played out here. This, of course, brings us to important questions hanging over the whole race. How much of a price did Kamala pay for being a woman? And not only that, but a Black woman and a Southeast Asian woman. There certainly are racist people and sexist people. We can't quantify this because we just don't know. I will tell you this. Years ago, when I was at CNN, they had me do a story on something called the Bradley effect. This idea that people will tell pollsters that they're willing to vote for a Black candidate, but then in the voting booth, they don't. The report we did at CNN at the time found that there was no Bradley effect in Obama's election because people pretty much seemed to do what they said they would do in the voting booth. It's also a fact that women and Black people have a much harder path to positions of power in America. This also gets at nuanced stuff. Like some people associate toughness and strength with men, and therefore decide that Trump will be tougher against certain dictators, even though he hasn't done anything to show toughness toward Putin, for example. The opposite, actually. Listen to my episode about masculinity in politics. There's a lot of performative stuff, and in many ways, it takes a lot more toughness and strength to be in Kamala's position than in Trump's position. So maybe gender and race did have a big effect on this. You can find arguments in all directions. It's also important to note this. Other Republicans who tried to run on these same issues did not do as well as Trump. I discussed this last week. It's not clear that even those people who preferred Trump on these issues necessarily prefer Republicans in general on these issues. Now, what about foreign policy? The New York Times paved the way yet again for a crazy, obsessed guy to make a totally nonsensical claim. The head of a large international organization asked about this, and I responded. That is coming up. Mandatory humble brag time. In order to get the word out about this show, I need as many people as possible to rate and review it. One thing that I've done to incentivize that is promise to read some on the air. That ends up meaning that I, in my own voice, say all this complimentary stuff about myself, which might be uncomfortable, but is what has to happen because this is how we get the truth out to people, especially in the attention economy. All right. Quote, all of Josh's podcasts have been outstanding. He is a man of the people and shines a light on the truth. That is from Susan on the platform Podchaser. Here's another one. Phenomenal podcast fact-checking the media and its bias. That is from Ailey on LinkedIn, actually. Thank you. And we have gifts for you when you do this. We have these cool stickers and magnets for your car or computer. We'll be happy to get you those. And now we have a new, easier way for you to rate and review. Here's how it works. In the show notes and at my website, you will see one place that links you to all these different platforms on which this show is carried. You can just go to that one place and click on any of the platforms and see what they have in terms of rating and reviews. You can give it 5 stars. You can type in a little review. We will see it pop up and we can get in touch and send you a thank you to everyone who is taking seconds of your precious time to do this. Thank you so much. We live in a world of algorithms, and these ratings and reviews are the way to get these platforms to tell everybody that they should listen to. Do you have an opinion about anything? You're human, so it's a safe bet that the answer is yes. Do you have an opinion that you would love for huge numbers of people to read or hear? Well, for lots of people, the answer to that is yes, also, which is why so many people offer op-eds to the media. I know this world well. I do op-eds for lots of news sites, and I bring op-eds from people I work with to news sites. Opinion editors at publications are some of the best journalists I work with. They're often very open-minded about different angles and ideas and ready to hear new perspectives. And what I often do is use op-eds to fact-check the media. But not every place is so awesome. There are some places in which op-ed teams are controlled by biased people with deeply ingrained ideologies who will only run pieces that match those ideologies, with very rare exceptions when they face great pressure. The biggest example of that is the New York Times. The New York Times says no to just about everything that they're offered, and a lot of that is purely numerical. There's so many people who want to be published there, but it's also ideological. The New York Times devotes op-ed spaces to people who carry water for the New York Times agenda. So it was not shocking to me when I saw this post the other day on social media, on Threads. This was from the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt. He showed a New York Times opinion headline that read, quote, "Democrats ignored Gaza and brought down their party." So it was for a piece that nonsensically argued that Kamala Harris should have been harsher against Israel and that somehow that would have led to her winning. Jonathan Greenblatt wrote this, quote, "Disregarding all of the exit polls in order to retroactively scapegoat the Jewish state for the D's actual defeat is just as dangerous and indefensible as proactively scapegoating the Jewish voter for the R's potential loss. Why does the New York Times publish such indefensible nonsense?" Here's what he was talking about in there. I talked about this in a previous episode, and I did an op-ed for it, actually, for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Before the election, Trump proactively scapegoated Jewish voters, saying that if he lost, they would bear a lot of the blame, which is crazy and dangerous and nonsensical, given how tiny the Jewish population is, and given what happens to any group that Trump accuses of blocking his path to power. As for why the New York Times published this latest piece, here's what I replied. Because the New York Times is institutionally biased against Israel. And then I used the version of a hashtag that says cancel NYT there. I canceled my subscription a while back, but I still have the ability to see any piece in full without paying the Times for it. And that's something that my paid subscribers can do as well. I teach you how. This piece was by a guy named Peter Beinart. The New York Times editorial page publishes him all the time, as long as he takes whatever's going on in the news and somehow twists it into his latest screed against Israel. This is a guy who said he wants Israel wiped off the map. He's never said that about more than 50 Muslim nations, but somehow they always have room to publish him. I was reading this alleged post-election analysis. I thought of something a listener wrote me that my great web designer put up on the website. He said that this show cuts through webs of sophistry. When I was reading this New York Times piece, that's the word that came to mind. Sophistry is defined as subtly deceptive reasoning or argumentation, or the clever use of arguments that seem true but are really false. That's what this piece is filled with. Americans do not share this extreme anti-Israel, wipe it off the map, anti-Semitic agenda. There's nothing concrete to suggest that Kamala being even harsher against Israel would have helped her at all. Pluralities of Americans support Israel in the war. That means more Americans support Israel in the war than don't. Peter's piece is filled with these out-of-context claims and numbers that can mislead you. I wanted to give you one example. He said the New York Times reported that the Trump campaign had found that undecided voters in swing states were about 6 times as likely as other swing state voters to be motivated by the war in Gaza. I went looking for what he's even talking about. There's this piece in October about the Trump and Kamala campaigns, trying to figure out who swayable voters are. And buried way in there, there is this line.
The Trump campaign's research found that up-for-grabs voters were about 6 times as likely as other battleground state voters to be motivated by their views of Israel's war in Gaza.
That could mean anything. It could mean that some voters were turning against the Democrats because of the anti-Semites on the left. Lots of people know voters who fit that description. I know voters who fit that description, who have always voted Democratic in the past, but moved toward the Republicans this year because of all the anti-Israel stuff on the left. This could also be a reference specifically to Arab and Muslim voters in Michigan who are overwhelmingly anti-Israel. And as I reported recently, Arab and Muslim voters have been moving toward the GOP anyway over LGBTQ issues, which they generally oppose. They're socially conservative. This out-of-context number, 6 times as much, it could mean anything. It could mean most swing voters care so little that they're only like 0.1% swayable on that issue, but some are 0.6% swayable. We have no idea. But the New York Times had no problem letting him use that to try to justify a nonsensical argument. You've probably heard me say truth requires 2 things, facts plus context. Well, this op-ed includes out-of-context alleged facts. He picks and chooses various survey data and ignores others in other ways throughout this thing. Also, it leaves out the whole context about how little foreign policy even factored into this. That is what I went looking for. What do we actually know about the role of foreign policy here? As I've told you, there are these 2 exit polls. I went and looked. One of them, there's this graphic, and I'll make it available through the newsletter. It has these circles that show the top issues for voters. Like there's a circle that shows 39% said the economy was their biggest. And then there's a small circle, 7% said climate was their top issue. Well, foreign policy is such a tiny little dot that they don't even have a number in there. And the dot is way tinier than the 7% dot for climate. So who knows how tiny it is? Reports on the other polls say only 4% of voters named foreign policy as their big issue. And again, that could mean anything. There are people who believe Trump will be tougher against Iran, and Iran is a threat to the United States. So there is nothing to back up this New York Times piece. This, sadly, is par for the course for the New York Times op-eds. A recent study looked into it.
The findings reveal serious and repeated errors, inadequate corrections, significant omissions, and poor editorial supervision. The findings raise questions about the credibility of the Times coverage of Israel.
And that's an audio version of this study, which I'll make available to you. You can read it in full if you want. It dug into a bunch of times that the New York Times has had all these reporting failures over the past year, specifically against Israel. And then after a while, when they were called out about it and the pressure mounted, then they finally ran some sort of corrections. Here's another little piece of that study.
She based her argument on Gallen's false quote and misled both her editors and readers. On 12 January 2024, she repeated the same distortion in an op-ed titled "Don't Turn Away from the Charges of Genocide Against Israel."
Basically, there were these op-eds with false quotes and out-of-context quotes and other falsehoods. And after a while under pressure, the op-ed team was like, okay, we'll put a little note over here and then check a box saying we took care of it. But they continue to do what they did. All right, coming up, what role did the media itself play in this election? This show can exist because of support from people like you and from organizations that support us, like MIT 45, a leading manufacturer of products that include kratom. Based in Salt Lake City, Utah, MIT 45 is known for its extracts, capsules, and raw powders. The company is committed to quality and purity. All MIT 45 products meet the MIT 45 Gold Seal of Approval, surpassing industry requirements. MIT 45 supports athletes, fitness enthusiasts, and those seeking natural wellness solutions. The company is dedicated to advocating for consumer protection and safety on a national level. You can listen to my interviews with CEO Ryan Niddell in previous episodes. And there's a website they encourage you to check out, the Kratom Research Institute. You'll find it linked in the show notes and in the newsletter. There's also another great way that you can support this show. I have been asked to help spread the word on some campaigns, not political campaigns for candidates, but campaigns involving issues that you might care about, issues that I care about. Here's how it works. Each of these campaigns is available for a limited time, and I'm given a unique link that's just mine. If you click that link and sometimes just look at a website or watch a video or sometimes take an action or sign a petition, Then, the group behind that Get Out the Word campaign makes a small contribution to this show, and that adds up quickly. Here's how you can find out what those are at any given time. First, be sure to get my newsletter. They're included in there. And second, I post these on social media. I post them on Instagram. You can find me there. I know a lot of people are now moving over to Blue Sky. I might do the same. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Lebs. A bunch of listeners have sent me articles and social media posts about the role of the media itself in this election, and specifically about how people are getting information, how much they even know or understand about the candidates, how much their decision is driven by truth. One of these pieces that I was sent is from Politico. The headline and subhead say this: an overlooked and increasingly important clue to how people vote. Most election postmortems neglect a key determinant of how people vote, where they get their news. It shows a survey from earlier this year. This was back when Biden was still in the race. The overwhelming majority of people who got their news from newspapers were going for Biden. So were a majority of those who got their news from national news networks. More Biden supporters also said they get news from digital websites. But when it came to other sources like cable news, social media, YouTube, more people were supporting Trump. And among people who said they don't follow political news, they were supporting Trump over Biden 2-1. That article is far from alone. Some of you have sent me others as well. And there's a great guy I know who posted about this on social media. He talked about the role of old-fashioned AM radio, all those right-wing radio shows that have been fueling a movement for years. All this really gets at two different ideas, and it's important to separate them. First, where people are getting information, and second, how much truth they're getting. If you've listened to previous episodes of this show, then you know I point out that newspapers get plenty of things wrong. So it's not like everyone who gets one type of information is learning pure facts and everyone who doesn't is learning pure lies. Let's break this down. First of all, both parties know that this is happening. Here is a clip from that New York Times story I mentioned earlier from October. In this section, the Times was talking about the Harris campaign trying to reach people who might have still been swayable.
They are not watching traditional news platforms or other programming with large mainstream audiences, said Meg Schwensfire, the chief analytics officer for the Harris campaign. To talk to them, we have to take a layered approach. We have to be on TV, non-traditional platforms, door knocking, billboards, digital ads, mail, everything really. The campaign's data drove its decision to invest in advertising time during Fox News' daytime programming, when more women are watching than in the evening, when opinion hosts draw an audience that skews male and less persuadable. It also factored into Ms. Harris' interview on Fox News.
It also discusses how she went on Howard Stern's show. Some people are crediting Bro podcasts and saying they must have helped Trump and Vance a lot. That is possible. We don't have data around this stuff right now to know for sure how much of an impact any of these specific outlets had. But this other idea of knowledge and who knows what's going on, that can be trickier than it sounds. If people are turning away from certain traditional sources of news because they get stuff wrong, that is a good call. I have encouraged people to unsubscribe from certain big newspapers. The problem is not having trustworthy sources of news. So who knows what people are hearing when they look for these other sources? The American Bar Association does an annual survey about civic literacy and a webinar along with it. And when it was announcing this survey, it played this at the top. It's a collection of clips.
And now, here's an overview of what Americans are thinking.
Get ready for the latest voter suppression attempt.
42 states out of 50 don't require photo ID to vote. So that means that it's like if you really want somebody to win, you can drive to every city and I guess submit a voting ballot.
I do think that the mail-in ballots were used to politically manipulate.
They're trying to ban TikTok so that they can suppress the youth vote in the 2024 presidential election.
Joe Biden's executive order is allowing illegal immigrants to vote.
With misinformation about the upcoming election flooding our screens.
So they showed that lies and ignorance are, of course, widespread. That survey focused on people's concerns about civic literacy rather than testing people's knowledge. But a bunch of other surveys do look at people's knowledge and have depressing findings. One of these was from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation earlier this year. It found that 70% of Americans fail a basic civic literacy quiz on topics like the 3 branches of government, the number of Supreme Court justices, and other basic functions of our democracy. Another survey found very low knowledge about certain things in our government among young adults. But this does not automatically translate into votes in either direction. There was a Pew survey last year about civic knowledge in general that found that people who identify as Democrats and Republicans were basically tied in their knowledge of certain basics about how our government works. But even that doesn't make clear how knowledge affects any specific election. There are multiple surveys showing that majorities of Republicans believe the big lie about the 2020 election being stolen, not majorities of Americans overall. So, how many voters this year believed that lie? We don't know. I also pointed out previously in this show that a majority of Americans age 44 and younger thought that Israel has controlled Gaza all these years. They literally don't know what they're talking about. So there is plenty of ignorance to go around. I would love to be able to come to you with hard facts showing a knowledge survey among people who voted different ways in this election. As of now, that does not exist. But it is something I want in general. When surveys are conducted, there should be questions looking into what people believe and whether those things are true or false. If there's a survey saying 80% of Americans say the United States should do this, I always want to see a breakdown of how many new basic facts involving whatever that topic was. Unfortunately, most surveys don't include that. But hopefully some will. If there is a survey that has legitimate methodologies that looks into knowledge among people who voted in this election, I will be happy to bring it to you. And if you see it before I do, let me know. As always, I want to hear from you. There are 2 great ways to reach out to me. So much of what I cover on this show is inspired by you. First, there is a form that anyone can fill out, and it's such a good thing I used this special kind of form because it avoids the spammers and bots. Here's how it works. In the show notes or at my website, joshlevs.com, you'll see a link to this form. As you're filling it out, it sends you a unique code to your email, which you then type in, so it guarantees that it's from you. That way, your message does not get lost in a sea of bot forms. And the other way to reach me is for paid subscribers to the newsletter. You can send me messages inside the newsletter system, which is called Substack. You'll see that, joshlevs.com/newsletter. If you become a paid subscriber, you can also post in comments there, and we take a look at those. Paid subscribers to the newsletter, you are the first ones I look to for what to talk about on this show. I am so grateful to everyone listening and everyone doing what you can to support the existence of this show. Thank you so much, as always, and I will see you next week.